My name is Joan Beal. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and also co-director of the Global Health Program. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our Global Health Colloquium, the second event we have this fall. And we are thrilled to have with us today Professor Catherine Panter-Brick, who is Professor of Anthropology, Health and Global Affairs at Yale University, where she directs the program on conflict, resilience, and health, and the program on stress and family resilience. And she told us yesterday she's soon going to be appointed as director of the Global Health Program of Yale as well, which is also an undergraduate program. And if we have questions about that later on, you guys can reach out to Professor Panter-Brick, and she can share some of insights of what they are doing in terms of also global health training at Yale. Her research addresses issues of risk and resilience in context of war, forced displacement, famine, and poverty. For her work in humanitarian areas, she received the Lucy Merit Medal awarded by the Royal Anthropological Institute to honor excellence in the application of anthropology to the active recognition of human dignity. And she'll be talking to us today about how can we bring anthropological theory and methods to bear on pressing social issues, just as humanitarian crises. Panter-Brick publishes extensively in biomedical and social science journals. She has co-edited 7 books, most recently Medical Humanitarianism and Pathways to Peace. She's also the senior editor of medical anthropology of the interdisciplinary journal Social Science and Medicine, known by many as the premier journal on social science and medicine. It's hard to get published there. But if you're interested in also talking to Professor Panter-Brick, who is a wonderful editor and curator, that's a wonderful opportunity as well to reach out to her after the event, discuss your projects, etc., etc. So she leads several research initiatives, and she can share some of them with us as well. And for her recent work with refugee youth, she was funded by the Wellcome Trust and the UK government. So it's a great, great pleasure to have Professor Panter-Brick with us today. Let's give her our warmest welcome.
You're too kind. Good afternoon. How are you? Sorry I'm a little late, I think. What I'd like to do today, if you don't mind, is to provoke some kind of thought and discussion around this question that I obviously wrote this morning. I was thinking about this, which is how do we researchers and practitioners and policymakers work together to serve people in need? And the short question is, how do I or you or anybody contribute to the field of global health, or in my case, the field of mental health and psychosocial programming, or mental health and psychosocial support. So what can I do as a scholar to make a slight difference to the way that we are putting in place regimes of humanitarian assistance for refugees in the field of global health? So I speak as a medical anthropologist. You know what a medical anthropologist is. And I'm a peculiar medical anthropologist because I believe in biocultural approaches. So I do the bio and the cultural path hand in hand. So as a medical anthropologist, if I define myself as a medical anthropologist, because I have to remember this in the field, it means I learn from people and from their lived experience, meaning that I put an emphasis on cultural engagement and local knowledge, which is not necessarily what other disciplines may look for. This is what I aim to contribute. I assess how lived experience etch themselves on the body and the brain as a biocultural anthropologist, and I work to measure lifelong impacts in difficult contexts, in crisis contexts, in cross-cultural contexts, in global contexts. And in particular, I look at mental health, stress, and resilience, and what that means in other contexts than ours. And so I got to this point very happily in 2018 or 2017, when I thought that what anthropologists did, and I wrote this in social science and medicine, that we do a reflective, engaged, critical, interdisciplinary approach to health. And now I think this is not enough. I would add that we need to reflect on how to mobilize support for people in need, to reshape research and practice, And to do this, I would argue we have to build very strong partnerships across disciplines, across sectors of policy, research, and academia. And I want to give you an example of maybe how we can achieve that. And I take the field of humanitarian interventions because there are here huge challenges in this field. So in 2019, the UNHCR, the United Nations Agency for Refugees, released this report that says we're over 70 million refugees and displaced people in the world today. That's twice than we had 20 years ago. It means that I believe one person is displaced in the world every 2 seconds, or maybe 2 people every 1 second. Don't quote me. I hope you're not taping this because I should have my facts right. But it's a very kind of a magnified crisis. And what do we do about it? So the Filippo Grandi, the United Nations in charge of refugees, says that we have to renew our solidarity with refugees. And how do we do solidarity with refugees? What does that mean? Scholars say the system is broken. We need to invigorate it. We need to make it anew. We need to rethink, and we need to upgrade our humanitarian agenda in order to make itself more adaptable, more accountable, more effective, and I love this sentence, to truly put people affected by crises at the center of our efforts. So it's a people-focused effort, not program-focused effort, right? There's a big difference between whether I'm in love with my programs or I'm in love with my people in the sense of the way that I think about assisting in the world today. But the point is that we're here with a great deal of tension at top and a moment of innovation at the bottom. So how do we innovate on this? The big question is simply, what should we do in response to humanitarian crisis? What are we going to do? Where do we start? Humanitarian people are very practical people. They're there to triage suffering and to offer assistance and to do. So what do we do? And in answer to that question, it's interesting how the humanitarian agenda, you don't mind me giving you this kind of stuff at the beginning, I hope. Okay, thank you. Please object if you would like to. This is how I think. So the humanitarian agenda is growing. So the first thing you have to do is save lives and alleviate suffering, the first mandate, and build systems of layered support across sections of protection, health, education, and livelihood. You have to put all that together to do some good stuff in humanitarian action. And this is what we call, when we're being critical, crisis humanitarianism. You respond to a crisis and you save lives, alleviate suffering, and build a little bit of stuff. And now people are thinking that we can do more than that. We need to lay the foundations for recovery, sustain hope and dignity and resilience and social cohesion in these broken societies where refugees come and resettle, and when there's great tension between hosts, citizens, and refugees. And we call that resilience humanitarianism. There's other ways of calling that, but it's basically an idea that humanitarians does more than just deal with emergency crises and has to build the foundation for support in the future and build the foundations to give people their dignity. And what does that mean? In Jordan in particular, we are at the moment of so-called crisis. At the moment, there's actually 671,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan. That means that 1 in 15 people in this room, for instance, would be Syrian refugees. That'd be over and above Iraqi, Palestinians. They are non-citizens. 93% of them live not in refugee camps, but outside in semi-urban areas or rural areas, so that we live cheek by jowl, citizens and refugees, and make good our lives. And many humanitarian organizations like Save the Children Fund say that children's lives are torn by war, they are suffering from toxic stress and trauma, and all this impact their development, so they put the emphasis on this moment, especially for the new generation, which they call the no-loss generation. If we build efforts to basically put in the foundations and then focus on that point to rebuild people's lives. So then you know you have to do something, and the problem is what kind of interventions are you going to be? What kind of health intervention are you going to put first, given that the need is great and the resources are few, and the people are few, and what kind of mental health interventions are you going to put to work? And the problem in that is that we have a lot of ideas and we have a lot of interventions, and it's a bit like going into a field and seeing 1,000 beautiful flowers, and you've got to decide which flower to put in, which one to plant, which intervention to seed. And the problem is that about 5 years ago, we said we don't know what works in mental health humanitarian programming. We don't really know what mental health programming, how it works, how good is it, how efficient it is. And in fact, when we started looking at this, we found pretty disappointing stuff. We said the impacts of mental health and psychosocial interventions is actually very small, and if it's not small, it's very variable about its context. It's not the same in DRC, and it's not the same in Syria, and it's not the same in Germany. And so they call on to academia, scholars, to try to unpack the evidence of what works and where does it work. And we say, hold on a minute, what works is a boring question. What we want to know is why it works and for whom it works. So we complicate the question even more. Humanitarians just want to say, does it work? And we say, yeah, well, it works a little bit here, it works a little bit here. And we want to find out why and what makes it work. So that's where we were in kind of 2015. An example, just to show you why people got a little bit, discombobulated, was the favorite intervention to put in crisis settings is called child-friendly spaces. You come into a crisis and you build a space, safe space for children to be, and you give them footballs and swings and coaches and adults so that you can make them go on the path of recovery. And when it's very simple, it's very scalable, and it's very popular, and it doesn't work. Because when you evaluate it rigorously, you find that, as I said, the impacts are small and variable. So, for instance, you ask 3 questions. Are children protected? Do any of you do epidemiology and know what effect sizes are? So the D there, if it's 0, means 0 impact. If it's 2, it's moderate impact. So are children protected? No. Is well-being enhanced with the children? Yeah. Are communities mobilized? No. So it's basically a C- in terms of an intervention. It's really disappointing because that's what we use as the first step towards recovery. So we've got to put something more robust in place. And the other question is, if you want to put something robust in place, is how do you partner together? So this is a slide of our team in Syrian, Jordanian field workers interviewing a Syrian refugees. And how do we partner? And so who do we partner with, and how long, and how do we talk together, etc. That's a big, important question in our mind, what kind of partnerships we put together. So let me criticize partnerships just a little. In fact, I don't have to because somebody else already did. It's called academics are from Mars and humanitarians are from Venus, right? And we have no grounds for interventions, for talking either. So, because we have different mandates. So imagine that you guys on the right are academics and you want to all increase knowledge about interventions, but you guys on the left, you're humanitarians. What you want to do is protect kids in situations of crisis. And the relationship between you and you is difficult to build on the fly. It requires actually some kind of funding to put together. It requires sustained conversations, because otherwise you're always going to do your own mandates. And in a focus group in London, for instance, Levine asked these academics what they thought of humanitarians and what the humanitarians thought of the academics. So this works. So you guys are the academics, you're theoretical, intellectual, unrealistic, disconnected, and tricky to work with. You really are. And you, humanitarians, you are misfits, missionaries, mercenaries, passionate and tricky to work with. You're tricky as well, right? And so it's all good to say that we're going to work together, but in fact, devil's in the details, and you're kind of tricky to work together. So you have to go a bit more. And I say actually that this is the analogy of the solar system. There are many more players. There are the funders that hold the power of Jupiter with respect to structuring your relationships. Let's say academics can only come at the end to evaluate interventions that the misfits over there put in place. And you have the media, which is like Mercury, flying very quickly from one story to another and making the narrative about what is important to do. And you have communities, and you have the people, of course. So you have these many different kinds of planets that are orbiting around this humanitarian system. We've got to navigate all that. So I'm going to give you a case study, which is the evaluation of a mental health and psychosocial intervention with youth. And I'm going to reflect what makes for successful partnerships in the context of a crisis, where it's not like stable, it's chaotic, it's more than difficult. And emphasize that the reason we're at the table together in this room is only driven by one question, which is what works in humanitarian programming. Maybe not the questions that you guys, academics, want to answer, but that's what you want over there to answer for sure. So, Mercy Corps in particular asked me to come and evaluate that particular kind of interventions. Did I do this?
No, I think
Is
this is supposedly an intelligent room.
Please calm
But
down.
figure why.
All right, are you still with me? Okay, fine. So the Mercy Corps phoned me up and said, please come, would you be interested in coming to evaluate our program? And I'll find out a little bit more about it. And because I'm driven by this mandate of what works, bringing credible evidence, I put together this research consortium. So basically, research consortium means research partnerships. I have a humanitarian partner, the INGO, the international NGO called Mercy Corps, who has a long track record working with youth in the Middle East in crisis situation. I need an in-country partner. I reach out to Rana Dejani, who is a Jordanian, Syrian, and Palestinian of origin, who's a professor at Hashemite University, and also the leader of Tagir, an organization that works for social advocacy, and that has great trust or track record in disadvantaged communities. And I'm funded by ELRA, which is Enhanced Learning and Research for Humanitarian Assistance, funded by the Wellcome Trust and funded by the UK government. And I find my academic partners, 5 universities, and we work with local NGOs and community-based organizations and all these planets are starting to move around this way of evaluating things for a year and a half. This is the intervention that we were asked to evaluate. It's called Advancing Adolescence, or Nobardia. It's 8 weeks long. It says for 8 for 15-year-old youth affected by Syrian and Iraq crises. It's based on profound stress attunement. It's implemented as part of the No Lost Generation initiative, and it's rolled out in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, potentially reaching 400,000 children. It's strategic because it focuses on the next generation and building its future. And it's innovative because it serves both Syrian refugees and Jordanian hosts who are poor and live cheek by jowl in the same place. So it doesn't just work on refugees. The program theory is this way. You want to do protection, safe spaces. You want to repair relationships for kids, and you want to give them some skills, because that's the way people do it. They give them soft skills of social emotional learning, or actual skills such as all the Syrian girls wanted to do first aid, all the Syrian boys wanted to do hairdressing, all the Jordanian girls wanted to do is computer repairs. I'm exaggerating when I say all, but you see those kind of skills where people ask for skills, and the program is very flexible in delivering the kind of programmatic, the kind of skills that you get. The stated outcomes is that if you do that in a guided way in 8 weeks, you will reduce profound stress, you will build resilience, you will build social cohesion between Syrians and Jordanian hosts. And eventually, you'll just have a great society and people have improved life chances. So if you dissect what the Mercy Corps' programmatic theory is that they have to be strategic in choosing the right support at the right time, and that is for the 10 to 19-year-old, because they're on a path of suffering or on a path of resilience, and a path of no success or a path of success. And that's the framework they present to donors. And they want to bring in scholars, for scholars to say that it works or not doesn't work, so that donors can fund again their initiatives, because the donor cycle is 6 months. So after 6 months they have no more money, and they have to come with credible evidence that it does work, so they have another 6 months of money. It's based on profound stress attunement, and I'll come back to this picture. But just to make sure that the goals was to establish that robust evidence of impacts, and the innovation that I wanted to do was do some kind of research that answered both the call of scientific rigor and the call of cultural engagement with populations. And I wanted to do something that actually made a difference for institutional culture or institutional policy. Meaning, what does WHO think of mental health and psychosocial interventions in the world today? Do they think of cultural translation, or do they think of cultural engagement? I'm fighting on that level, for example, because translation is not the same as real engagement. So the research was difficult. The design was a randomized controlled trial with data collection at 3 time points: pre-intervention, catching everybody; post-intervention, 11 weeks later; 1 year later, 11 months later, to see whether there was any impact left over once kids had been left for a year on their own. And there was a lot of give and take discussions at a stage about what we could and could not do. At first, Mercy Corps wanted us to work only with refugees. They didn't want us to have a control group, and they wanted their implementation team to be the research team. And on all 3 fronts, it would be do or die. I said no on that. But then they made other interesting changes to the way I was thinking something could be done. We took a cohort of about 800 kids. It was gender balanced sample. And you can see that Syrian refugees have witnessed a lot of war trauma. Can you see at the back? Okay. A lot of war-related trauma, and the Jordanians suffer some violence, but it's not necessarily war-related. So there's a stark contrast. And what you don't want to do is have the Syrian be the intervention group and the Jordanian be the control group. You obviously want 50-50 to go through this intervention. And believe it or not, but to do a randomized controlled trial is difficult, because the community says, I want to be in the intervention. I don't want you. You can be in the control group, but I'll be in the intervention. So convincing people that it had to be a random draw, as opposed to putting the most needy people in the intervention and the others in the control, was a big scientific discussion. And to resolve it, it's the community themselves who came up with the design of doing the measurements and then picking a blue or a red lollipop from an opaque bag. If you got a blue lollipop, you were in the intervention group. If you got the red lollipop, you were in control. And Allah would decide. So that was a way of really, we were at stalemate with respect to organizing the research and design until the local community said, we know how to do it, so this is a visible and that is a fair process of experimentation. Now, we do some mixed method evaluations. I'm going to kind of gallop through this bit. You can slow me down by going like this, or you can make me gallop further by going like that. I don't know what you're interested in. But I want to say that we measure the impact of, I went crazy. I want to say I wanted to measure the impact of stress elevation on the mind, the body, the brain, and the society. Why not? I'm there. My partner, Rana Dajani, is really, really on board. The community is really, really on board. The community wants to know if Mercy Corps programming actually has any leverage. So let's do it. So how would you do it? How would you do an impact evaluation? I forgot to ask you, but you might say, ask the kids what they feel. So obviously the first step is is self-report of mental health. That's a classic way, in fact, the only way we know how to evaluate an intervention. It's an important way, but it's limited in the sense that it's always going to be affected by who's asking you and how you perceive your stuff. So I wanted to do stress biomarkers, which are kind of an innovative way of measuring stress in your body. You can do it in very many ways. And the way that we decided was the coolest was to take little samples of hair at the back of your head, and the closest to the scalp, 1 centimeter closest to the scalp, is picking up cortisol hormone, which tells you 1 month of your stress levels, chronic stress levels. So for instance, we know that if you are going into a surgery before and after, an exam before and after, a divorce before and after, I can pick up the difference in stress levels in your hair. So we thought that might be an interesting way to do that. Mercy Corps wasn't happy with that method at all, because it was going to starkly say whether things would work or not work. The community was very happy with that, especially because we gave them cool haircuts at the same time. And we're the only team in the world who had hairdressers as part of their field team. But it worked in that sense. They understood that if you can measure stress in the hair, fine. So I could talk about hair for a long time, but I won't. I said I would go fast. Test of cognitive function, these are tablet-based games to find out how attentive and reactive that you are. And test of social cohesion, where you ask about trust. So the first question, did stress attunement do anything when they passed through that intervention of 8 weeks? Obviously, we have to put layers of ways of finding what insecurity or stress or anxiety or depression or these measures mean. So we have a battery of international and local measurements to find out what they are, what it does say. And in the end, what it says was that insecurity changed in a medium effect way, stress changed in a medium effect way, anxiety and depression too, and resilience, there was no effects at all, however you measured resilience. So to give you an example of insecurity, pre-intervention, half that sample of Jordanians and Syrians would say that they felt almost, always, and most of the time insecure at the same level of people reporting in Gaza. But after this very short intervention, they had lower insecurity scores. So as you see in the treatment group on the right, insecurity scores in the middle bar drop after the intervention, and 1 year follow-up, they're still even further dropped. So you can see that the intervention has a medium but very significant, prolonged, sustained effect on their insecurity scores. And insecurity is a great way of measuring mental health in a conflict situation. It measures fear. It doesn't measure depression. Most people are fearful. And so insecurity is a scale developed in Gaza, for instance, to measure the impact of war, or active political events on individuals. For resilience, we actually had to develop that measures because most resilience, as you may know, is understood in the West as psychosocial resilience, like do I have the strength and do I have the courage to keep going after somebody knocked me down? This is kind of a ridiculous concept. In the Middle East or other places, it's really about, do I have a peer? Do I have a family? Do I have a teacher? It's relational to help me through to help me go through my adversity. Or contextual, do I have what people call contextual means in the Middle East sometimes faith and community. Am I proud of my traditions as a Syrian? Am I faithful to my faith, to my religion? And that helps me with resilience, that helps me with moving forward. This concept of moving forward, that's really important. So it takes it away from just an individual understanding of resilience. Second, did stress attunement regulate physiological stress? So we measured this with hair. What we found was that the cortisol levels declined by 1/3 pre to post intervention, and that was a very, very strong proof that improving your social environment, even with just 8 weeks, matters for your stress cortisol levels, which are picked up by biology. So we can see kind of like a scientific, objective evidence that confirms what people are saying when they say they feel less insecure. I'm going to skip that. Did it improve your cognitive skills? Well, Mercy Corps believed it, but the answer is not at all. it had no impact at all. And the kind of test is this: you have an iPad, and you have to touch the opposite side of the screen when this little dot appears. And I'm really bad at this. I'm so bad at this, I can't concentrate. It's not the same as IQ, but it's a fact of alertness a little bit. And we found that there was no at all impact of the intervention. But what we did see is that the cognitive skills were diminished with ongoing poverty in both Syrian and Jordanian cohorts, as opposed to trauma. And kind of this just came out, and people are saying, what do you mean you can't find the impact of war trauma on cognitive skills? Well, you can't, because it makes you more vigilant, so you get better at this game. But poverty, that knocks you down. So it's kind of an interesting dimension. Finally, does it improve social cohesion? And now look at that. This is like really poor science. All it does is, do you trust each other more now that you went through the intervention? And of course they'll say yes, probably. Why? Because they had contact together, so they learned to have friends. But it's not proven that it's because of that mechanistic stress alleviation. Because if it were, that would be really important. That just reducing stress is the gateway to improving social relationships as well as mental health. So you've suffered enough, thank you. The main job of a researcher is to come back and ask the difficult question is, so what? I mean, why do I care? How does it matter? What did I actually show after 1.5 years of journey? And I want to talk a little bit about that. Notice there's an absence of answers on the slide. But the key takeaways for my relationship with the humanitarian organization would be this: that I have to be in person to discuss these results with people and make them alive and understood. I have to convey what matters, and the bottom line is that adolescents affected by the Syrian crises will benefit from the kind of psychosocial support that Mercy Corps puts together. You might think it's like very individual level, very band-aid kind of approach, very this and that, but this is what is funded, and this is obviously what is working. I have to also manage the expectations of you guys, humanitarians over there, because remember, I'm tricky. Regulating stress is great, but it doesn't do everything else that you say it might do. It doesn't boost resilience over time. It doesn't increase your cognitive skills. It doesn't increase your social cohesion necessarily, because you probably measured it a little bit in a difficult way. To achieve all the stuff that you want to do, which is alleviate stress and boost resilience, you have to do more substantial investment. And they took that on board very strongly and now working with families as opposed to working with kids. So that's kind of a big step forward for policy change. And then I have this really corny take-home message. Please laugh at me if you want. But science has power. It has the power to bring together Rana Dejani to the WHO, because she's the lady that did hair sample with me, and hair sample is so innovative that people are saying, oh. So the scientists are completely kind of like, we're the poster child for the scientists, for the humanitarian world. I'm exaggerating, but it comes a little bit like that. It has power. It also has power for the communities, because try and do this in Gaza and people will say, go away. We don't want you to biologize or measure our suffering with biology. We are all about social justice and politics. The Syrians are saying, on the contrary, please, put us on the map. If hair cortisol is it, put us on the map. Make people tell our stories. So in that context, this kind of over-the-top science really helped cement long-term relationships about what we're doing. And they have asked us to come back to look at the intergenerational signature of trauma, not just the biological signature on the child, but the intergenerational signature of trauma. Now, obviously you might say, where are the people in this talk? I haven't seen many people in this talk. Obviously you can't take photographs, but beside which, what do people say themselves about their situation there? And here, when I think about that, and I'm nearing the end of my talk, when I think about that, I think of doing what Seth Holmes has called a vertical slice ethnography. And I do a vertical slice ethnography of the humanitarian system. I go and look at what the UN policy does, what WHO does, what ELRA does in the UK, what institutions, academic institutions do, the way humanitarian partners act and their institutional culture. And then I go to regional tensions on the ground, I look at families, and then I hone in on the individual lived experience. And for me, that visual slice ethnography enables me to connect these macro level processes and these policies at the top level with lived experience on the ground. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about lived experience to finish. The robust science is one step of good science, but it actually is really meaningless unless you can achieve some creative insight. And the creative insight of this work was really to shift or reposition the narratives of risk, where we say that Syrian refugees have damaged brains by toxic stress and trauma, a very dangerous narrative that emphasizes suffering and emphasizes compassion and emphasizes rescue. To pivot to another narrative, which you find actually people holding themselves, which is much more a narrative and a story of resilience and agency and dignity. And I think, you know, the immersive experience of being in Jordan and talking and the acts of interviewing and storytelling enable to do that shift. So, as a backdrop, let me do the middle slice of that ethnography. Regionally, what is happening is really a site of huge tension between refugees, citizens, and local institutions. Think here, think Germany, think Greece. You know, there's a site of incredible tension between what you do when you have a million refugees crossing the border or more. And in Jordan, there has political repercussions. So in Jordan, for instance, the government then has decided at one point in 2018 to shut out the border because more and more refugees were coming through and they were politically dangerous people. It shut out the border and then saw a very interesting backlash on social media where the hashtag Open the Border was the most seen hashtag on Twitter in Jordan, where people kind of like rose against their political representative by saying, no, we have to act in solidarity with refugees. Shutting the border is shameful. So you had one part of society that said shutting the border is shameful, and one part of society was saying, please shut the border, because we can't cope with this influx of refugees. That's politically. In terms of social tensions, a lot is erupting in the northern governance. This is an example in 2013 where Jordans were just like basically absolutely fed up with the fact that the rents had gone 6 times more the prices that they had before. They could no longer afford renting their own homes because landlords found that Syrian refugees were going to pay more for some reason. So the rent prices really increased. And they decided to coalesce together and put in a banner that says Camp of the Displaced Jordanian number 1. You know, we're displaced too. We merit aid as well. We have rights. What is it that you are doing, focusing attention on Syrian refugees and ignoring our own poverty and our own lack of economic development in a region that has really been really affected by crisis? So they rise up against refugees. And then UNHCR, on the top level of that vertical slice ethnography, Grandi hails Jordan for doing such a spectacular job with this new model of resilience humanitarianism that will give job to refugees, not just a blanket and a safe space to live and a limbo place to live, but real dignity through jobs. So they made 80,000 jobs available to Syrian refugees, but there was a catch, obviously, because things are never simple on the ground. You could get, if you were Syrian refugees, you could get a job if you had a job offer from an NGO, but to get a job offer from the NGO, you needed a permit. So basically, it was catch-22, and those NGOs that gave an offer of employment without having a work permit could be shut down because they'd broken the law. So the 88,000 jobs existed on paper. And that shows to you how the government of Jordan has to navigate this incredible tension between its contract to citizens and its contract to refugees. And it hasn't signed the United Nations Declaration for Refugees. It says that these people are guests in the country. They're not refugees. So how welcome do you make your guests feel? And to what extent do you enable them to stay? What do you do when there's 1 out of 15 of your population in the country who is a refugee or a Syrian guest? So there's very, very strong narratives of inclusion and exclusion going on in the country. And the tensions are very sharp. And this wonderful report does the interview in the heavy lifting of finding out what people think and do. Jordanians say, how can I accept the Syrians when they're taking my rights, taking my house, taking my job, marrying my daughters with low dowries, having no idea about conserving water, and we live in the desert, sending their girls with too free expressions on the street, all that kind of thing, cultural, environmental, social, economic, and political issues. And then the young Syrian boys say, why are you talking to me that way? Why are you talking to me and spitting in my face? I had to flee Jordan. I am a guest in your country. So they make this point about the tensions that exist between the narrative of a guest and the narrative of a refugee, meaning the narrative of hospitality that has limits and the narrative of rights, which are all or nothing. People on the ground, again, that's the narrative in the region. People on the ground, many Syrians, despite that tension locally, portray themselves as having the ability and the agency to realize their dreams, the rights to live with dignity after resettlement, and the hope to gain social respect. That's about all they want. And so you can see that in certain works of ours, and I've turned to visual ethnography to be able to represent these, since I can't take pictures of people, to show how refugees intersect with humanitarian organizations that are acting in solidarity with refugees. So the point I'm making about this big kind of stuff, background stuff, is that there is tension, but there's also civic society rising up to say, hey, this is shameful. We need to act in solidarity with our guests and with people in need. So this is an example of visual advocacy. It's a book called Questions in the Suitcase. The author is a refugee, Maya Abu Alayat, and the illustrator is a Chechen, Ishraq Othman. Rana Dajani, as the director of the advocacy organization, is publishing these kinds of books, and the books are to work with children to drive change in the community. So we love reading in Arabic. It's called Tagir. Tagir means change. They want to make a change in the community by kind of like making the stories of children known. And this page has the caption, where did the refugee giraffes store their memories? And I like this because it says it has the refugee pictures of the giraffe buffeted by balloons in very dangerous environments, in high winds, barely escaping the dangers lurking in the water, waving their handkerchief to the country that they left behind, looking towards the past and the people they loved, looking down towards the struggles of the present, and looking away to find out what their hopes and aspirations for the future might be, at the same time as their memories fall away. This is another page called Do the Birds Need Passports to Enter Hungary? And this is an image of birds. Each refugee is a bird carrying a handkerchief, carrying their passport or their documentation in their beaks and all their possessions on the backpack, flying across the skies as birds do, but refugees cannot, arriving in Hungary and being able to be hosted there to sleep under the flag. And it's an irony because at the time Hungary had just shut the doors to refugees, and the kids are saying, why do birds can fly and I cannot? Why do birds have rights and I don't? This is a drawing that I already showed you, which is the portrait, a painting from a young Syrian man who went through the Advancing Adolescence program with Mercy Corps. It's a 6-foot drawing that's quite remarkable on the sites of a youth center, which draws an understanding of what it is to mean move forward. And what does it mean to be able to fly rather than stumble under the weight of adversity. It is to connect your heart and your brain, to reduce stress, to understand your goals, to have power, physical power, but also emotional and intellectual power to realize your goals. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to say that those are the kinds of things through the interviews that we did of children and adolescents that went through the program understood that power of aspiration. And this guy who drew the painting ended up by creating a rap band called ATM and becoming a local hero in the region. And he uses rap and art to advocate for drawing down the tensions between refugees and citizens. Okay, so I come back to my question, which is more complicated. How do we come together across different groups to improve health, to change narratives towards positive narratives of resilience and inclusion, and to innovate on systems of humanitarian assistance to do more than just crisis humanitarianism? And in my mind, this means that we have inclusive partnerships that just don't deliver programs, but foster critical discussions on anything that really matters. And at this point, it is social cohesion in the region and resilience of refugees. And a method, which is, for this audience, called vertical slice ethnography. You can't say that to the WHO, they will just laugh. To connect, to look at how institutional practices and lived experience connect. Resilience humanitarianism is an approach that tackles system to address everything in structural and social terms. It is not an individual strength. It looks at power dynamics, and it looks at a social compact between your citizen and your institution. What you promise, what the state promises to deliver when you elect state representatives or mayors in the cities. Very often civil societies are the first to take action for refugees or take action against refugees. And that allows you to address the thorny questions of citizenship, jobs, housing, education, peace building, the things that people are caring about. The important thing to do in resilience humanitarians is just to find out who are the actors that make change. So Tagir, the social advocacy in Jordan would be a good example of an actor that makes change at a local level. The funders in the UK is a good example of funders that want to structure partnership between academics and humanitarians to make a difference. And I believe this is my last slide. I'm put this picture up because it is a picture of how science has represented this work, this partnership. It is sexy because it does two things. It looks at very robust science, and it puts together, and is pivoting the relationship between humanitarian and academic sectors to bring in more partners, bringing the local academic partner to the table, bringing the families to design the research. So my take-home message is simply that these strong partnerships that are very inclusive, should be inclusive, are the way forward for a professional model of humanitarian assistance that is not a rescue or compassionate model of humanitarian assistance. I believe I got carried away and just made 2 points here. That it's exciting to be able to put together some robust science in partnership with communities, that have communities actually be excited by stuff like hair cortisol or messages that are there, and that it's very challenging to try and move institutional cultures to have an idea of what is the political economy of suffering and resilience, and move the discourse from suffering to one of resilience and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. The way we like to proceed is we want to collect bundles of questions. So we want to exercise, to the extent possible, condensation in our brief comments or questions. So we want to collect a series of bundles of questions. Okay, so who would like to get started? Angelica?
Okay. My question is, how are humanitarian crises defined Three, how are they triaged and by who? How are they defined, triaged, and by who?
Okay, great. That was your question? Yeah, yes?
Yeah, I was piggybacking on that. Given your limited resources, do you have a triage model that some might be more likely to benefit than others? And adding on to that, you mentioned cortisol. Do you have a biological model, for example, length of telomeres? Do you have the resources to measure that? Would some of those people be more likely to benefit than others?
Do you have any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more maybe about the two different concepts of resilience, or sort of more local one and the more culturally specific one that was relevant here, and if you had to convince anyone to use the one concept versus the other, and how you plan to do that, if so.
Yes, please.
How do you balance different kinds of evidence that you gather? So how do you decide whether you want qualitative scientific data to inform whether your intervention has had an impact versus sort of the qualitative stories that you're also telling?
Okay. It's the first bundle.
Cool. Can I go?
You can go. Go.
I mean, go.
No. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, so luckily I had a pen. Thank you for your question. So your question is about which humanitarian crisis is defined in triage and so too. So as I said, namely my metaphor is that there's a solar system and all the humanitarian organizations are different planets, let's say. So the important thing is to understand that they each have a mandate. They each define their own mandate. So Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders will be about saving lives, and Mercy Corps will be about youth, for instance. So Mercy Corps is not going to do something that involves Ebola necessarily, but it will do something if it sees as a part of it. So their triage is really focusing on youth. Many people focus on women, other people focus on something, a health crisis. So I think the triage occurs with respect to the mandate of the organization itself. When you get to the question of who's most likely to benefit, then it's very, does that answer your question more or less? That's the first. The triage is actually your mandate. You get money for your mandate, and you do your mandate, and you trust that somebody else is collaborating to do the other stuff that you need to do. Who's more likely to benefit is a very thorny question, because the issue would be, do you want to take a hair sample or look at the cheek swabs of somebody biologically determined that they have the most trauma and then triage them? I would be totally against that kind of biologicalization of suffering. I think it's a useful objective measure of what happens in the body, but what happens in the body is only one part of the story. I think people in psychiatry would say if they have trauma, they need a trauma-focused intervention, and if they have psychosocial stress, they need that kind of intervention that we're talking about. The two are not consonant at all. So in fact, we are looking at cheek swabs and telomere length, etc., because Syrians have asked us to do that. Their mothers and their grandmothers have stories that they want us to document in terms of the impact on their pregnancies. So for instance, a mother's been shot by a sniper during her pregnancy. She wants to know herself. She wants me to demonstrate that there is a horrendous cost to war for the children, because they believe that story needs to be told. So it's very, I don't know how to answer that question, but I don't think you can just, have a kit to find out who is most at risk in that sense. Mercy Corps is always saying, does this mean that we should just do Syrian refugees, or we can do also Jordanians? And I said loud and clear, you hear the story that the Jordanians themselves benefit, because this is like a low-level intervention, short intervention, that just makes people go from hypervigilance and hyper-insecurity to some form of calm. So it applies to everybody. It applies both to a refugee who's 2 years into settlement and somebody else who's just come out, and to the host population who is feeling that kind of insecurity. It's a long answer because I haven't got a short answer to your question. About the local and cultural and specific concept of resilience, what I like to contrast is this kind of resilience that Syrian refugees think. They visualize it. I'm a very kind of visual person, so they visualize it as either a crocodile, so you become tough, or as a bamboo, very flexible. So if you're resilient, it's because you have an uncle who's going to be giving you a job over there, right? You're resilient. It's an entirely different concept than the one you have in Palestine, which is sumud, which is standing steadfast against the force of injustice, which is standing your ground. That's also resilience, but it's resilience as force. This is resilience in the face of domination. So you know the same sumud versus muruna. You have steadfastness versus flexibility. Our word for resilience may be fortitude. You know. So you have these. So it's basically polysemic concept that means everything and nothing, and you've got to kind of pin it down to either images or concepts that matter. But they can mean many different things. You know, it could be fortitude, it could be standing steadfast in the face of adversity and violence, and it could be being flexible and drawing all your resources together, which is what I get strong and clear in this population. And finally, balancing qualitative and quantitative data and doing qual-quant research or quant-qual research. You have to decide. I've had a conversation at the World Bank about big data and small data. And big data, you know, being the mapping the mental health disorders and doing something big to look at patterns of what are, to understand patterns so that you can intervene in that way, and small data, which is the ethnography, insightful, creative kind of insight into a problem. And the answer is very easy. What you need is good data. It's either small or it's small or it's big, but it has to be good. It has to be relevant. It has to be powerful. So sometimes you need good data. You need big data, sometimes you need quant data, sometimes you need qual data, sometimes you need to do the two together and figure out if they coalesce, because usually they tell you different things, very often. And then if there's a tension between what they tell you, then that's truth.
Let's collect the next round of
I talk too
questions.
much.
No, it's wonderful. It's
I'm starting to
wonderful.
enjoy myself
So we have
now.
we have Adriana, Alexandra, and Sebastian, and then I'm the fourth here. But then we have another bunch.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the connection between resilience and solidarity, and particularly about the role of knowledge and science in building solidarity, and thinking long term, you know, beyond the 8 weeks. What sort of data points could you imagine constructing that can, you know, leverage research to keep reinforcing the kinds of solidarities that you're building, that you attribute so much, you know, resilience to?
Yeah. Alexandra?
So you're talking about the model of humanitarian assistance and how it's not about rescue, or a compassionate model, and you emphasize the strong partnership aspect of it. And it's kind of like a collaborative project, and you can correct me if you see it as such. And I wonder what for you would the ethics of collaboration be as a medical anthropologist?
Sebastian?
So I was wondering about your practice as an anthropologist. When you go and talk to people, kind of engage with their everyday stories, is that seen as a kind of therapeutic intervention as well? Do people take that as a sort of something that gives them peace in a moment of terrible harm? And going through that question, how do you then define the bounds of this intervention? Like, are there different things that are happening alongside this intervention, like the measuring like all these other relationships that are happening alongside intervention that can also be seen as therapeutic in ways that are not considered within the definitions of intervention.
The question that I had, I think it's two questions built in one. First, the point you made, science has power, right? And then the cortisol levels, etc. Right? So, but we know from other studies and other interventions that many times when you find those markers, you also pharmaceuticalize the condition, right? You bring treatments in, and that's a kind of an intervention that follows in the wake of. You didn't show that part of the story, and I don't know if that followed. If there was treatment made available, for people or not. Could treatment make a difference? And think of Byron Good and Mary Jo Good's work in Aceh, where they brought in, their teams and things like medications, or what is that doing to the pharmaceuticalization of trauma, which we know follows these biomarkers, cortisol levels. And then it was striking, and I really loved the whole presentation, the projects, it got to be rich. But in the end, when you brought art in, it's almost like art has power.
Yes.
So science has power, art has power. And I wonder, how those things could be, measured, assessed, right? Because those things generally fall under other kinds of rubrics, maybe it's not quantifiable, you cannot show, you cannot demonstrate the impact. But again, those intangible things that certain kinds of interventions, be it listening to a person, be engaging in artistic work, can have a different kind of effectiveness. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on that, on the power of the arts.
Goodness. So, Adriana, you talk about the relationship between resilience and solidarity. And it's actually really interesting in my more recent work on the US-Mexico border, where solidarity is the way to resist state-led injustices. So rise together with a common purpose and resist. So that's the language of solidarity there is very, very strong. In this here, the language of solidarity is not so strong, except at the level of the UN that says, hey guys, we've got 70 million displaced people, let's redouble our call for solidarity. What that means actually is we can't do all of it together, so we have to partner with businesses and civil society so that they help give us jobs too. And the state can't do everything. The state is either overrun or ineffective or can only do so much. And so our solidarity actually is key for, are there any other partners in the room? What about businesses? Can you employ Syrian refugees? What about the solidarity there is key for please let's find a way of a whole society approach to humanitarianism and not a UN-led humanitarianism or a state-led compact with the citizens. So you can critique solidarity in that way. More so than people who on the ground will just say, she or he is my Muslim brother and sister. Which is not necessarily a call for solidarity, it's just a call for humanity as well. So that's, if that answers your question enough. It's complicated, but solidarity can have many, many different kinds of layers, is what I would say. So does resilience, which is a concept that really does need to be critiqued, but I come back to. I think, Alexandra, you mentioned models of humanitarian assistance and ethics of collaboration. The ethic of collaboration is do no harm. It's actually do some good. You can't do good, so you have to do some good. You have to do limited good. And so a lot of my work, for instance, looks at the concept of limited good in the sense of a chaotic and disruptive and violent place, and whether you can measure some good. There is a beautiful Tanzanian folk tale of the monkey that rescues the fish out of the water that I use sometimes, and the monkey rescues the fish at great danger to himself. He climbs up a tree and dangles over the tree and rescues the fish and puts the fish on on the riverbank and says, thanks to me, the fish is saved and is now nicely asleep. And the point of that is that there is good intentions is the way to hell. So humanitarian has to do more than good intentions, but it has to do limited good. That would be my ethics, do some good. And my ethics would also be, I think then you asked for the practice of anthropology, and to be short, I would say the ethics is do no harm, but it goes all the way to listen, please listen. Listen to the fish, right? See that the fish has no legs, and that doesn't mean that he is incapable of swimming because he's got no legs, because the monkey sees he has no legs, so he thinks he's vulnerable, you know. So listen would be my ethic. The practice of anthropology and therapeutic intervention, is that what you were asking? I think, so when I first went, Rana, the Johnny said, whatever you do, you're not going to the field because you come from Yale. And I said, damn, when I was in France and UK, I had much more freedom. But now that I'm America branded, can I be Canadian? No. So I said, I won't go to the field. And I went to train the team. What I'm saying is that it's the team, the Syrian Jordanian girls, and the hairdressers who did all the interviews, and they suffered a lot themselves. It's very hard to ask these questions. And there was a moment where, I'm trying to slim down my crazy, complicated kind of research design. And the donor rejected my application once because I wanted to work with family, and says, no, we can't do it, it's too complicated. I said, fine, I'm just going to do children. I said, fine, you can go ahead. But I slimmed it down, and then I went there and I was asking about trauma and stress and stress. And the kids kind of said, why are you focusing on trauma? Why don't you ask us the good questions on resilience? And I said, thank you. So that's, in a way, that therapeutic thing is to turn something from a lens of suffering to a lens on what the discourse is, which they don't necessarily call resilience, but they say hope. So I think that was that. After 6 months, they took me to the field because you just needed to kind of prove yourself in that sense. But it was interesting that they were very, very careful as to who conducts the research. They were very thinking really, really carefully about both the impact on the research team. And the main reason they took me in the thing is not to help with the interviews, but to help the ladies, the field team, because they needed and they needed to believe in the research process. They needed me to see how complicated it was. And they started to write a book about their experiences. Apparently I'm in the book too. And it's about, laughter and crying. It's complicated, it's all in Arabic. But they kind of enjoyed the science, or not, as the case may be. So that kind of, me being in the field was more as a kind of sisterhood to the ladies doing the field. But I never did the interview, although I witnessed, with a child or with a father because I don't need to. The science has power, art has power. So I think, in terms about the pharma business, my big job in mental health, sometimes I don't think I make any difference whatsoever, but if I were going to make a difference, I would say that mental health is not just what's happening behind your ears or in between your ears. It's not about trauma and depression, etc. It's about the future. It's that giraffe thing. It's about how you understand the journey from the past, the present, and the future. Is whether you have a narrative that's coherent between the past, the present, and the future. So if you take veterans into the United States, for instance, and you focus all the time on what they experienced in the past without giving them dignity and power in the present and a trajectory to the future, then they go mad, and they say that themselves. So my whole point about mental health, I think, is going against the model that mental health is determined by your past I think it's determined by your future. And I think it's not trauma, full stop. It's about psychosocial well-being. So those are big fights. And then art has power. Actually, this filmmaker came at the last minute and said, we're making a film of Syrian refugees and we want to come and film your stuff because you're doing something exciting, you're taking care. And I said, oh, God. And he just showed me the film recently, and it's this one example of its incredibly powerful testimony about, because he films the field worker, Dima, asking those questions of the mother and of the child, and he films that whole process. But he calls the film Terror and Hope. And there's a lot of things that make you cringe about the film. And there's a lot of beauty and power in that film. And that film is going to get distributed to all the schools internationally. And there'll be, some people are going to see it and say, imperialistic science, they're taking hair samples. And other people are going to say, oh, so that is what the thing. So I think art has more power than science, but it's also out of your control. It's the representation artists make can be protest art as well as insightful lived experience art. So I'm in the process now of being part of a film that's going to be released. If you see it and you may decide it's the most ugly or beautiful thing. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So it's a little bit terrorizing for me. But the one thing I insist is that the voices are done. I mean, so he has to interview Rana Dejani, he has to interview Dima, he has to interview this. They have to have the full voice, and our voices of the Western institutions have to be very small. That's the only thing that I think. But art has much bigger power than science.
So we have one last round. Let's be even more condensed, right? So we have a few people. Yes. And then after this last round, you can wrap up your comments, in a very insightful way as you have been doing. Yes.
I found your comment about turning from suffering to hope really interesting. So how do you go about situating healing and hope and reconciliation, not in like the past trauma, but the future trajectory, as you said, like perhaps like outside of the scope of like Syria or Jordan? How do psychiatrists and psychologists how can they shift their approach and how they deal with traumatized individuals?
Yeah. Any more question? Or no? Okay, I have one then. And last night after we spoke, I actually went home and I heard Hard Talk, BBC, and Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, right, for her work on randomized clinical trials, was responding, and then the interview was, Hard Talk, her and saying, but come on, are you not just you just see what works and what does not work, but what about systemic things? What about the culprits, right? The main actors who make the situation this or that way, right? And I think she had a very interesting point, which borders somehow to the comments that you made, about the political economy at local, at meso level, the difference they make, and it's almost conveying a sense of a different way of thinking of the political field or the political implications of our works. She said, I can decry the major players and actors, but systems, to a certain extent, can work. And systems make a difference in people's lives, in communities' lives, right? And she said, our job is to produce knowledge that can make those systems do the best they can do, so that we don't lose those systems that are in place and have the potential to do some good. And that kept me thinking as you were presenting, there's some very interesting tweaking of the political role of knowledge production. And the way you combine at the end, those two dimensions where you say we need to think about the political economy implications of this new kind of humanitarianism, right? So I just thought maybe you could explore a little bit more of that, but I think there's something very rich in the way you are conceptualizing the political here as well.
Thank you. That's a compliment coming from him, I'm sure. On the healing, hope, and reconciliation, just in this context, the most important thing is to give a voice to citizens as well as refugees, because otherwise you don't get healing and reconciliation. If you see what I mean is that you are dumping a huge number of people in a small region, either putting them in camps or letting them cohabit with citizen population. What's really important for solidarity and reconciliation and hope and healing is to make that society work for children who are going to school together. So my point here is that most people will just focus on the refugees. Jordan is actually very, very smart. It's not taking any money for Syrian refugees unless it has 50% devoted to Jordanian hosts and 50% to refugees. So it's saying no more of this like target the vulnerable and the risky, make it work for everybody. So that's a very smart move. So that helps healing, because it's no good kind of like propping up refugees and then finding that huge tension that exists, that huge pushback that exists with the citizens. If it's not quite what you were looking for, but that is what I think is important in the region. For Duflo and who are the main actors, it's really interesting because if you, so I, in my World Bank conversation with economists, who I used to think were the devil, but in fact they're not. As an anthropologist, because they say, the economist is the monkey with the wrench. I have a system there, and he's got the wrench, and he's going to tweak that leg and tweak that arm up there, maybe change that mandible, right? That's working in the system and tweaking the system. That's having the knowledge to have the wrench to tweak something in the system. For instance, I get funding for Syrian refugees, and I get 50% of them for Jordanians as well. Could be a massive political tweak, but it's still a tweak. Well, actually, it's more than a tweak. I think it is a political act. But the economist is the monkey with a wrench. Or you do the radical innovation, which is bring a new system to the fore. And that's what people are trying to do. Forget about not be a monkey at all, but be, and not be an angel succoring people, but do something that's much more systemic. And that involves law, and it involves the media, and it involves public opinion, and it involves jobs, education, housing, that kind of, and a new generation. So when you see a culture change, it's really interesting because that's a culture change in the system. That tension between hospitality and rights, that's a new system. It's a new political narrative, which I think is not the same thing as having a wrench. It's a radical departure of that. And I also think when I was at the WHO, if nobody's from the WHO here, I might, and if not, people are not taping this, I might say it's run by a bunch of bureaucrats, right? Very thoughtful bureaucrats. The reason I say bureaucrats is because they are, again, focused on programs. So which mental health program is working, and not people. The people are not there. And so the role of anthropology and history and sociology and art is to put people back in the forefront of monkeys with wrenches who are thinking about programs.
Thank you so much for incredibly important work and for your wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you all guys for being here today.